So welcome to week 6 of Introduction to American Politics. This week we're going to be covering two branches of government, the Congress and the Presidency. And this is what most people think of when it comes to American politics. Certainly they know about the national government. They think about the president oftentimes. They think about Congress. Well, what exactly are these institutions, these organizations of government? Who staffs them? And what kind of powers do both of these governmental institutions have? That's kind of what we'll be covering this week. So in the game of politics, where we are is still very much in the center point of the game, and that is the idea of politics. We've talked previously about the game's ideas, getting governing power, democracy, republicanism, both small d, small r, the notion of federalism, the notion of constitutionalism. We've also talked about the players that link citizens to government, and that is part of the politics dynamic. What we're going to be moving into is really the points of both politics, but also leading into policy. Because if you think about the political behavior dynamics, remember I always talked about those ideas being linkage mechanisms, political parties, interest groups, the media, voters. They are linking the citizens to the institutions of government. And so this week, starting this week and into next week, we're going to be talking about those governmental institutions, those organizations that take political power and translate them into public policy, government decisions. Now, you can oftentimes think about, in the game analogy, that governmental institutions are where politics is played. If you want to think of it as a field, in basketball we play on a court, football on fields. This is the location where politics is played, and that is in governmental institutions. Now also, and this may get a little complicated, but I think you can see it play out, is that these same institutions where politics is played can also be players in the game of politics. Congress against the president against the courts against Congress. All of these institutions can also be thought of as players in the game. And so this week we're going to talk about two primary players, or the institutions, the fields, Congress and the presidency. Now, in thinking about Congress and the president, I just want to kind of give a brief overview, broad thinking about Congress and the president. And again, this idea that both can be a field where the game is played, but they can also be players in the game of politics. Congress primarily is thought of with its lawmaking power. The legislature, Congress made up the House of Representatives, the Senate, but other two branches, the presidency and, as we'll see, the courts, can also conceivably make laws as well. This goes back to the notion of separate institutions sharing power. How they share power is oftentimes broken up by these different institutions, but the same things, lawmaking power, can be shared across these institutions. In addition, Congress has other powers that you'll read about. The power to appropriate and the power to tax. Now, oftentimes we think of Congress as indeed a taxing organization. Nobody likes to pay taxes, but we have to pay taxes in order to fund government operations. And in particularly, so that Congress can appropriate those funds. Spending money is the power of appropriation. Congress also has the power of oversight, what we sometimes call checks and balances. How is the president operating? What powers do the president have in terms of executive agencies? Can Congress check those powers? That's the power of oversight. And then also, because they are representatives of states and districts, members of Congress provide what are called constituent services. These are activities designed to help people back home deal with the government. And in the chapter, you'll read about constituency services. Now, when it comes to presidential powers, oftentimes we associate the president with the power of executing the law. The president is the chief executive. He is responsible, maybe one day she is responsible, for carrying out the law that Congress passes. But there are presidential powers beyond executing the law. And when you get into chapter 12 on the presidency, be thinking about what are some other powers, both formal and informal, that the president has. I think over time, particularly over the past 50 years, both branches of our government have become symptomatic of the polarization. We've talked a little bit about polarization. There's a lot of articles, a lot of podcasts that you may want to consider doing about polarization, particularly when it comes to the presidency. But I think for political scientists, this has become a real issue and a real concern about the health of American politics and where things may be headed when it comes to the intensity of polarization. Now, with the Congress section, what you'll be doing is watching your second movie, and what I expect you to be thinking about when it comes to Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is to think about what is the view of Congress, and more broadly, what's the view of American politics through this particular film. And I think you'll see a kind of division play out. There are multiple themes in this particular movie that I'll talk about in just a minute. But one of the most important ones is, how do we idealize Congress? How is it seen in a very positive light? Jefferson Smith, a newly appointed senator, it has some really positive thinking about government, about what his role is. But as he becomes more and more of a senator, what you tend to see is a realization of what American politics is, and particularly what Congress is, when Senator Smith engages in a filibuster. And this will be something to think about as you're watching the film play through. Some things to think about as Mr. Smith Goes to Washington as you view the movie. Which of the following do politicians in the film represent? There are multiple ways that politicians, particularly elected officials, can represent. One of the themes in Chapter 11 is about representation. They could represent their principles. They could represent their people. Or they could represent their parties. Or perhaps some combination of the three. What's the view of the filibuster? We hear a lot about filibuster in today's political dynamics. What's the view of the filibuster in this movie? How do political bosses control and corrupt American politics? We don't have this problem per se in American politics nowadays. But when this film was made, the issue of political bosses controlling and corrupting American politics was very much at the forefront. What's the role of public opinion and the media in the film? And by the movie's end, what is the view of American politics? What does this movie leave you with in terms of thinking about American politics in either positive or negative lights? Your discussion board, along with your personal journal entry, will be focused on this movie. So some questions to consider about Congress specifically. As you're reading Chapter 11, and I'll be putting again these questions into Blackboard, but think about how Congress is structured. It is a very unique system by which we divide up legislative power, but then internally, within the House and the Senate, how are they structured? What is the leadership like? What are committees like? How do elections influence both chambers of Congress? How do members who want to serve in Congress be influenced by the elections back home? How do members of Congress represent their constituencies? One of the issues in the movie that you'll see is about representation. There's a pretty intense section in the chapter about representation. What are the different ways that they can represent their constituents? And then what are the various powers of Congress? Beyond lawmaking, as I talked about previously, what are some of the other powers that Congress can exercise? And then what's the process of lawmaking? This is a complex and oftentimes what a lot of people think of as a convoluted process. But there's a lot going on when there is the making of law. What is the process behind Congress? You'll get an introduction to that. Some questions to think about when you're covering the presidency in Chapter 12. How is the presidency designed and organized? Remember, the framers were fearful of a strong executive, a king, so they intentionally designed the presidency to be limited. But how has that limitation basically become loosened over time? What are the formal and the informal powers that the presidency has at its disposal? Very much constitutional authorities, but there are also some informal powers that the presidency have. How has the election of presidents changed over time? We've talked about elections, we've talked about voting, we talked about campaigns. This gives a little more depth to specifically how do presidents get elected? What is involved in electing a president? What are the different dynamics behind that? What organizations help the president to administer and execute the law? It's ridiculous to think about how much the executive branch oversees all of the different aspects of what they have to execute in terms of the law. The president has help. What are those organizations? And then finally, how can the president use his power to influence the nation and the public? Finally, what shapes whether a president is successful or not? We've debated a lot about when presidents are successful, when presidents fail. What shapes whether they are successful or not? So by the end of this week, you should be able to understand the role and the activities of Congress, particularly in American politics. Again, make sure to watch Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Think about how American politics and Congress are viewed, both positively and negatively. Understand the role and activities of the presidency in American politics. And then think about some of the dynamics between these two governmental institutions. Here you might be thinking them as players in the game, about specifically how politics and how policy is developed. And as always, if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to let me know. Good luck with week 6.